Hello, Book Stew viewers and listeners. It's not every day, or actually it's not any day, where I have a guest on the show who I went to nursery school with. This is a very unusual circumstance, and I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce you to one of my childhood friends, Paul Kalb. Good afternoon,
Hi, Eileen.
Paul.
Good
How
to see
you
you.
doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Good to see you again.
So let's talk about the origins of this book, which is called The Mystery Boy and Other Stories. And when we were in high school together, we worked on an underground newspaper called Frocks that you were really one of the co-founders of, and I was just a worker. And we got thrown out of school for it. There were court cases for us to be allowed to distribute it. So we also served together on the literary magazine in school, which was a lot of bad high school poetry, which I'm ashamed to look at now, but we did do it. So I feel like we've both been immersed in the world of literature somehow, whether it was what we wrote ourselves or what we appreciated in other people. So why don't you tell us about how writing became important to you, because you also have a blog. So
Right. So as you mentioned, I've always been interested in writing, at least as long as I can remember. So back in elementary school, I liked to write, and when we got into high school, we felt the need to express ourselves, and that's basically the genesis of the underground newspaper Frocks that we worked on together. And then later on in life, I became a scientist and did some technical writing for my job as an environmental scientist. But that didn't do it for me in terms of that bug to want to write. So I eventually started writing for a blog that I published, and that's probably about 15 years in the works, probably as long as you've been doing books too. And I wrote about, or I write about things that are important to me, whether they're a review of a book or a film or what's going on in politics. I just write stuff and put it on my blog. And about 3 years ago, my daughter gave me a Father's Day present, which was a subscription to an online tool called Storyworth, which is for writers, and it helps you get ideas and put stuff on, put stuff down in writing, and then eventually you get to publish a book with your result. And so I started doing that, and they gave me ideas for stories, and none of which really appealed to me, but it got me into the habit of thinking about and writing down some stories about my life. And around the same time, I started thinking about, my parents have been gone for 20 years or more, and I kind of missed the fact that I don't have a lot of stories that I remember from them. So I thought, well, maybe I ought to be doing some, putting some stuff down so that both my kids and my grandson will eventually have something that will be a record in terms of who I am and how I grew up. So a lot of my stories began to focus on sort of introspective stuff and my own life. And eventually, when I finished the book, it started was a memoir. I mean, it didn't go all the way through my life. It stopped at a certain point, but it was a contiguous description of things that happened in my life. And so I published it through Storyworth, and then shared it with a few friends. And eventually, some folks had suggested that I self-publish it, and that's what I did. So that's the book that we're talking about today, called The Mystery Boy.
With your blog is basically nonfiction. You also wrote
Correct.
you wrote a baseball story that was based on fact, but certainly had projections and fiction in it.
Sure.
And memoir to me straddles the line between fiction and nonfiction, because a memoir still can't be completely accurate unless you tape recorded every second you were alive. And especially when you hit our age, there's stuff that you forget. and if you don't have your primary sources, like parents, to go back to, it can be even cloudier because you've only got your own perspective unless you're going to be interviewing people for your memoir. So how do you feel about the writing fiction versus writing memoir, and did you have a hard time putting things in while probably not being exactly sure that that was what was said at the time?
Okay, so let me sort of take that apart a little bit. I did write at least a draft of an historical novel that you referred to. It was based on a real life character who was a Major League Baseball player who had a cup of coffee in the major league, so to speak. When I heard about this guy, it just sort of got me thinking, well, what was his life about? And I kind of made up a whole story with regard to this particular baseball player. And so that was a lot of fun. It was fun thinking about what might have happened in this guy's life. Now, switching gears over to the memoir side, I think your point is well taken. Many of the stories that I recount in my book, I tell as if I remember them pretty clearly. Not, I'm not sure whether or not that's because I really remember them or because I've heard stories about them through family folklore. So there's that, sort of strange, divide where you don't really know whether or not it's real memory or whether you've heard it a million times and that's why you remember it. But with regard to the accuracy part, I did my best to try and account for the way things happened, really. And I'm sure that some of it's an approximation, but I decided early on from the standpoint of making a story, it didn't really matter. So I didn't get too hung up on whether or not something was 100% accurate. I did my best and said, okay, this is what I've got.
Well, one of the, of course I read the book and I enjoyed it greatly, even the parts that didn't have my name in it. But one thing I noted in the book, and that I honestly don't even remember from us hanging out together, is that you have an older sister and an older brother, because they were so much older than you that they were just not around when we were hanging out. So what I wanted to ask you is, was it almost like growing up as an only child, since your siblings were kind of, if not gone, they were on their way to leaving home when you were, when you were 3, 4? What do you think?
No, for sure. That's a good point. My brother is 9 years older than I am, and my sister is 11 years older than I am. So that's a big gap. And I do have very strong memories of when they were home. And so I was obviously a pretty young kid at the time. But each of them had a pretty profound impact on who I am, I think. I had a very close relationship with them, and I still do to this day. But as you point out, by the time junior high school and certainly high school came around, they were pretty much out out on their own, off to college and beyond. And so my interactions with them were much reduced, and it was pretty much being like an only child. Good point.
And I have an only child, and sometimes it used to be a source of stress for me that, how could I not provide my child with companionship? And I used to ask her about it, and she would basically be very honest and say, well, that would mean I would have to share everything. So, I think probably that's how only children feel. But let's switch a little bit to Long Beach, where we grew up, because to me, Long Beach is almost the essence of the book, at least, through almost the end. Where we grew up is a very, very unique place. I almost think it's like Brigadoon. The town still exists, Long Beach, New York, but when we grew up there, it was like 80% Jewish. I only knew one person who wasn't Jewish, and we used to go to her house to decorate her Christmas tree every year, which was just so much fun, and so, we really looked forward to it. but it also made for a kind of certain political upbringing that was not common to, like, let's say, other towns on Long Island or other towns anywhere. What do you think about that?
Well, I do agree that our youth in Long Beach was somewhat unique, and part of that may be the demographics, but part of it may also be the fact that physically Long Beach is an island. We're set apart from the rest of Long Island a little bit, and we were within, yards of the ocean, a short walk to the ocean from anywhere in Long Beach. My particular house was 50 yards from the ocean. 50 or 200 yards from the ocean. And for me, that was pretty important. Of course, there was a boardwalk in Long Beach. A lot of the social activities revolved around that. So I think you can point to a number of things about Long Beach that were pretty unique. And interestingly, we both belong to a Facebook site that's, for people who grew up in Long Beach around the time that we did. And people always bring up little anecdotes and little stories that seem to resonate with everybody in a way that seems different than having grown up in other areas. To your point about the demographics, I happened to grow up in the end of town, the west end of town, which was somewhat integrated in terms of the working class folks in town, and it wasn't all Jewish. So from that perspective, some of that was good and some of it was bad. In high school years during the Vietnam War, there was a lot of different feelings in terms of the war, and I had long hair and I sort of stood out among some of the kids down there, and wasn't always appreciated. I recall a couple of times where people would be riding on the school bus and people would be, lighting my hair on fire and stuff like that. So it wasn't all great, but it was different.
Well, I think one of the parts I enjoyed the most about the book was knowing what you had gone through, being really like the only hippie in the West End. But then you looked back to kind of this little boys' street gang that was on Ohio Avenue, and there were some nice pictures of the kids you hung out with. I'm so glad you have that, and we'll show that. So there was one story in particular that we all enjoyed, and I was hoping you would do a little reading of that for us with the setup of how it all came about.
Okay. Sure. So this story is called The New Baby, and I'll read some excerpts from it. It's a story that may seem obvious, but had a little bit of a twist in the end, so here goes. In the spring of 1956, I'm 3.5 years old, and even though we had been there a few years, I was still the new kid on Ohio Avenue. I like to think I actually recall the events that occurred on my own, but since I was pretty young at the time, it's not clear to what extent the memory is genuine or simply the product of hearing the story repeatedly told over the years as part of family folklore. Probably some combination in between. Either way, this particular day marked a milestone in my young life, stepping across a threshold into a new phase of my childhood for which there was no turning back. Child psychologists would probably argue that maturation is a gradual process and does not occur in discrete steps. But this felt different. It was not an artificial hallmark moment celebrated with balloons like kindergarten graduation, but rather a much more organic and genuine eureka experience that feels like the proverbial light bulb being switched on inside your head. And in this particular case, it represented a simultaneous physical and psychological maturation. From my seat at the kitchen table, I hear the doorbell ring and recognize the young, raspy voice coming from the porch as my mom answers the door. It's my new friend, Jay, from up the street. Hi, Mrs. Kalb. Can Paul come out to play? This was a frequent refrain in those days, part of the ritual where kids called on each other, meaning they actually showed up to see if they could come outside to play the various and sundry street games of the time. No prearranged play dates, it was all ad hoc and spontaneous. If the kid you were calling on was not home or otherwise unavailable, you moved on to see if someone else on the block was free. Oftentimes the group enlarged and several kids showed up together, especially when team games were involved. This, of course, was strikingly different than today's norms, where kids are kept on a much tighter leash with prearranged activities and schedules and almost never have an opportunity to roam free. Well, hello there, Jake. Why don't you come inside for a few minutes? And without waiting for his response, my mom pushes the latch and swings the door open. Paul's just finishing up some lunch, and then you kids can play. Would you like a snack? Jay was about a year older than me and wasn't the least bit shy. He marched right in to join me and took a seat at the Formica kitchen table as I finished the last of my macaroni with cottage cheese and ketchup. Okay, you're probably thinking the eureka moment was culinary in nature, having to do with the realization that this was a very crude approximation of pasta with fresh tomato sauce and ricotta topped with some pecorino romano. You're on the right track, but that realization, unfortunately, was several years down the road. After we finished our snack and were leaving the kitchen to head out to play, Jay looked up, and at once my world stood still. He noticed a bunch of gleaming glass baby bottles lined up, drying in the dish drain. And that's when it happened. I should have seen it coming, but was totally unprepared. Mrs. Kalb, I didn't know you had a new baby, he blurted out in genuine surprise. Of course, there was no new baby. Those bottles were all mine. Mothers in the 1950s were discouraged from breastfeeding, and feeding babies commercial formula from sterilized bottles was considered healthier. While mature for my age in many respects, I stubbornly clung to the last vestiges of toddlerhood and still hadn't given up the habit of drinking milk from a bottle before nap time. A recent study indicated that despite the fact that the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends babies be encouraged to give up the bottle between 12 and 18 months, up to 22% of children were still using bottles regularly at 24 months. Okay, at 3.5 years old, I was an outlier and more like the 5th percentile when it came to bottle weaning. But in retrospect, to their credit, my parents didn't make a fuss about it, figuring I'd give up the habit when I was ready. And as it turned out, it took one sentence from my friend up the street to convince me I was more than ready. My mom managed to cover for me to made up something about the baby bottles, but the embarrassment was palpable. I managed to suppress my anxiety and spend the rest of the afternoon playing. But when I returned home, I immediately announced I wasn't a baby and would never drink another sip from the bottle again. I went cold turkey, and to this day, I'm proud to say I've never fallen off the wagon.
I love that story, but I was amazed that you wanted to read it because it's still a little like, but
Yeah.
another really important influence in your life has been music, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that because you've been playing instruments since elementary school. You also have had a very famous cousin. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit about your musical background and then tell that story. You don't even have to read it because I just thought of it off the top of my head, of the time that you and Terry were going to a concert and the tickets got left behind, because I thought that was a hilarious story. So
Indeed, indeed. So I grew up very fortunately hearing music all around me. My dad was a musician himself. He played saxophone in the Borscht Belt when he was young. But more than that, my family appreciated folk music, and from the time I was really a baby until I left the house, there was music going on all the time. So I really had a good learning experience from that perspective. As you mentioned, I also had a first cousin, Danny Kalb, who was a pretty successful a guitarist at first as an acoustic folk guitarist, and then in 1965 he formed the Blues Project, and they had some little bit of fame for a few years. And Danny was a really good guitar player, and was fairly close to Danny. Whenever he would visit, he'd bring his guitar along, and it was just really wonderful to be able to hear him play and watch him play over the years. The story that you mentioned, my wife Terry and I had tickets, happened to be New Year's Eve in 1972, so it was December 31st, 1971, at I'm trying to remember the venue in New York City. It just slipped my mind, but
the Academy of Music, maybe?
Thank you on 14th Street, the Academy of Music. So it was the band, and we showed up at the concert, and as soon as we got to the door, Terry looked in her pocketbook and she couldn't find the tickets. Apparently she had left them in another pocketbook at home. And so there we were, having bought these tickets, celebrating New Year's Eve, and we were just out of luck. So we went up to the box office, we told them our sad story, and they just kind of laughed at us because there were 100 other people outside wanting to get in, not having tickets, and who were we? So, they just thought we were making the story up. But they did say that if the concert started and nobody sat in the seats that we thought we had, Terry seemed to remember where they were, that we could enter. And so, the band started playing. We could hear through the open doors as people were coming and going. And the first song came, and the second song came, and then after about the third song, they checked and they found that there wasn't anybody in those seats. They let us in, and we were just on cloud nine. And the other piece of the story that was interesting was that it was New Year's Eve. The band was there. They had a brass section with them. By the way, they released that album as the Rock of Ages years later. But people were thinking, oh, this would be a great time for Dylan to show up. It's New Year's Eve. People just kind of wishing it to happen. New Year's Eve, the New Year came and went. No Bob Dylan. But for their second or third encore, I think it was, Dylan walks out on stage and the place just went nuts. He sang about 4 tunes, and it was really just a tremendous show, just a great show.
Well, we might have to provide more background on who the band is, because there are people watching who may not know that the band is a band as opposed to just an anonymous band. But
Indeed.
I also saw them in the city, and we could probably sit there and reminisce for hours about Woodstock, which we both attended, but I bailed out of early because I couldn't stand the mud, and you had gone on a bike tour and ended up there. But I wanted to talk more about childhood and kids, because we both have kids, and based on what came out in The Mystery Boy and what you thought about when you recounted childhood stories, what do you think is the biggest difference in your childhood and the childhood of your kids?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think, well, Long Beach was a community that was very close knit, and especially, probably the same for you, but on the street that I grew up, there were kids playing all the time, and as I mentioned in the story, people would call on each other, and you just were always out with friends. So from a social perspective, it was pretty special. And that sort of has gone away, probably even in Long Beach, I would think. It's just the fact, the way people are living today in suburbia, people's lives are much more controlled or whatever. And even our kids, didn't have a lot of free time to roam. So they would, get together with other kids, but it would all be prearranged. And so I think that was a big difference in terms of how kids grew up in our time versus our kids' time. I think that's the thing I can think of off the top of my head.
I think there are pressures that we put on our kids that our parents did not put on us. I don't think our parents' when they were born, decided that they had to go to an Ivy League school or they had to play professional basketball. So I think, we were brought up with the expectation, yes, we would go to college, and that was a given, even though neither you nor I went to school right out of high school, in my case, mostly to just protest the whole thing, and also because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I think we were brought up being allowed to not know what we wanted to do. Yes, they wanted us to be doctors and lawyers. And another unique thing for the two of us is that our mothers both worked out of the home, which, not a lot of moms did at the time. But now I think, in addition to you can't be a free-range kid and just run around anymore without adult supervision, everything, it seems to me that for a lot of kids, everything in their lives is aimed at achievement and achieving future success by the standards of the parents. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for kids to be just kids and discover what they want to do.
Yeah, that's true. Although I like to think that my wife and I have a fairly good attitude, or had a fairly good attitude with our kids in terms of letting them decide what they wanted to do, and support them to whatever extent we could. Our kids did go to college right out of high school, which is different than what you and I experienced. But it wasn't, I don't think, because we pressured them. I think that was just what they wanted to do. I'm not sure, whether or not that's really that different for our kids. I'm not sure.
Well, I think there are financial pressures that didn't exist when we were kids. Because, when you look at the difference, many families could have just one person working. I don't know, maybe it's me and maybe it's the idealism of my past, but I just don't think achieving financial success and beyond success, all the way to wealth, seemed to be a common goal at the time, where now the steps that you have to take to make you successful usually would be those that would also achieve big financial success as well. And somehow I just don't think that was a factor, and I think that's a shame, but there's so many reasons that happened. There's so many reasons that we became competitive about our kids, that our parents weren't. I mean, I bet our parents weren't sitting around going, well, my doctor said she's in the 95th percentile for size of her nose, and stuff like that I can remember doing with my friends who had babies. We were always just so worried that our kids weren't keeping up with each other, or this kid was smarter than our kid, and gifted and talented, and all that stuff that really wasn't around when we were kids.
Yeah. About the differences in terms of expectations for kids. What I was thinking about was, my parents didn't really push me that hard in terms of going to college right away, which was nice. And I wound up getting a job and learning a trade. And it wasn't until a few years later that I decided that I would go back to college and get a degree, and pursue a career in science. But you can't. I think it's harder to do that today. I think that for somebody to make it in the career that I was in terms of environmental science, you really have to go to college. You have to get a postgraduate degree, perhaps even a PhD. I just did it a different way. So I think from that perspective, things are quite a bit different today than they were during the time that we grew up.
But since we're running out of time and going back to your book, I want to recommend the book to everybody, because even if you didn't grow up on a barrier island, and even if you didn't become a scientist, there are great stories in here, especially for the generation after ours, I think, and I'm sure your kids get a lot of pleasure out of the book, for what was, I would say, a very happy childhood in a great place to grow up, and just some reminiscences that are great. But I think your essential intellect and goodness shine through in the book, and I think anyone would enjoy reading it. So I assume it's available on Amazon, right?
It is, in fact, Amazon or Barnes & Noble online.
And I also want to say in closing, that I wanted you to read the portion about the mystery boy, but you didn't want to give away too much in the book, and I understand it, but readers and listeners, the mystery boy story is one of the fascinating stories in the book. So Paul, I want to thank you so much for reliving our past with me today, and I wish you great success with the book. It was a really enjoyable read.
Well, thanks, Eileen. I really appreciate that. I enjoyed coming on and talking to you about it, and I hope people get some pleasure reading it. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Book Stew viewers and listeners, I promise that Paul will I promise Paul will be the only person from my past that I'll be bringing on, unless the rest of our class of 1970 Long Beach High School writes books, which I really hope they don't. But if they do, I'll review them and I'll have them on Book Stew. So watch out for The Mystery Boy and Other Stories by Paul Kalb, and have a good night.